Jasmine Lee was just an ordinary high school student. Black, sitting quietly in a first-class seat with a perfectly valid boarding pass in hand. But the flight attendant didn't ask. Instead, she loudly questioned her and rudely demanded that Jasmine vacate her seat, forcing her to move to the back of the plane in economy class. Meanwhile, dozens of passengers sat in silence watching without a word. Not a single person stood up to defend the girl. Not a word of protest. But when Jasmine picked up her phone and sent a brief message, everything changed. Within minutes, the plane's engine shut down. The captain suspended the flight, and federal authorities were immediately dispatched. What the airline didn't know was that Jasmine wasn't just an ordinary passenger. She was the very reason the entire flight was delayed. Seat 3B in the first-class cabin cradled the small frame of Jasmine Lee, a 16-year-old girl with thoughtful eyes and a worn-out blue backpack clutched tightly to her chest. That backpack had accompanied her through many scorching summers and freezing winters, and now it had become her quiet companion on the most important journey of her life. Outside the window, the soft morning sunlight stretched across the endless runway. Jasmine gently rested her hand on her knee, lightly brushing the strap of her backpack as if to calm herself. This was no ordinary flight. This was a coming-of-age milestone, her first trip alone. No parents, no relatives, just her facing the vast world beyond. The first-class ticket in her hand had been purchased with all the pride of Dr. Evelyn Moore, her godmother, the woman who had always believed in and supported her. That ticket wasn't just a reward for the outstanding achievement Jasmine earned at a summer science program where she had outperformed hundreds of students from across the state. It was a symbol of the belief that she belonged anywhere she chose to be, including this luxurious first-class cabin. Jasmine sat upright, headphones resting lightly on her ears, though no music played yet. Her favorite science book lay open on her lap, her heart buzzed with excitement. Yet it brimmed with a quiet pride, the pride of someone who had worked hard, studied diligently, and proven herself. Passengers boarded one by one, and the first-class cabin gradually filled with tailored suits and faint scents of expensive perfume. But Jasmine paid no mind. She gazed into the deep blue sky, sunlight casting a glow on her brown cheeks, reflecting the early maturity of the quiet young girl. At that moment, Jasmine had no idea that just minutes later that peace would be shattered. The quiet pride in her heart would face a challenge so cruel it defied belief. But in that fleeting moment, Jasmine Lee sat there alone, but not lonely, like a flower awaiting the storm. As she let herself enjoy the first rays of morning light shining through the window, the steady sound of high heels tapping against the carpet caught her attention, and the attention of the entire first-class cabin. Karen Mitchell, the head flight attendant, strode forward with the confident gait honed from years of service. Her uniform was crisply pressed, name tag gleaming on her chest. Everything about her exuded authority. Her carefully made-up face wore a faint smile, one that seemed programmed, usually reserved for passengers she deemed worthy. But when Karen's eyes landed on Jasmine, a black girl in a worn gray hoodie, old sneakers, and a tattered backpack at her feet, that smile froze for a moment, just long enough for Jasmine to notice. In that split second, Karen's eyes flashed with suspicion, as if Jasmine's presence in first class was a mistake that needed correcting. Without hiding her doubt, she strode straight to seat 3B and planted herself directly in front of Jasmine. Her posture haughty, her voice rang out louder than necessary, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "You're in the wrong seat." Not a question, not a polite reminder. It was a command, cold decisive, as if Jasmine's presence there was an error that needed immediate fixing. Jasmine flinched slightly, looked up the sunlight still lingering in her gaze now met with Karen's icy stare. In a polite effort, she replied softly, "I think this is my seat." 3B, Mom." Karen leaned in, arms crossed, her eyes sweeping over Jasmine as if the girl had just said something absurd. She glanced at the ticket poking out from Jasmine's hoodie pocket, a cursory glance without real intent to verify. Then she coldly stated, "This is first-class young lady." The words, "young lady," dropped from her mouth with a deliberate inflection, as if the mere fact that Jasmine was a young black girl meant she had no right to be here. Around them, a few passengers, men in suits, women wearing pearls, began to glance Jasmine's way. Some curious, others disapproving, but not a single voice spoke up in her defense. Karen stood upright, eyeing Jasmine like she was inspecting undeclared luggage. In that moment, she was no longer a flight attendant. She had become a gatekeeper, someone who believed she had the authority to decide who belonged in that space and who did not. And with all the prejudice hidden beneath her professional mask, Karen Mitchell made her judgment the moment she saw Jasmine Lee. "You don't belong here, not a word of verification, not a single question for confirmation, just a cold statement. You don't belong here, Jasmine Lee." Bit her lower lip gently, trying to stay calm as a slow-burning wave of anger rose in her chest. She tightened her grip on the strap of her backpack with her small hand. One question echoed sharply and painfully in her mind. Is it just because of the color of my skin? But Jasmine didn't argue, not because she thought Karen was right, but because she knew this. In spaces like this, any form of resistance could be twisted into causing a disturbance. Karen Mitchell was waiting for a reaction. A raised voice, a reckless gesture, any small excuse to turn Jasmine into the problem. But Jasmine didn't give her that. Her firm silence was the counterblow Karen never saw coming. Jasmine lifted her chin, her eyes calm beyond her 16 years. Under Karen's scrutinizing gaze, she calmly reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out the boarding pass carefully wrapped in a glossy plastic sleeve. With all the politeness she'd been taught since childhood, she held it out without fear, without hesitation, just as she had done countless times at bus stations or scholarship testing centers where everything had to be transparent and fair. The words were printed clearly. Seat 3B, first class, undeniable. But instead of inspecting it properly, as any professional flight attendant should, Karen gave it only the briefest glance. A passing look as if the card had no value at all. Then she took half a step back, eyes narrowing, lips pressing into a thin, ruthless line. And right in front of all the passengers in first class, her voice rang out shrill, sharp as a razor. "No way, you need to go back to economy." Not a polite suggestion, not a request for further verification. It was a sentence delivered to her face without trial. The air in the cabin instantly froze. Whispers died. Typing halted. All unconscious gestures, fastening seat belts, flipping through magazines, stopped cold. Every gaze turned to Jasmine with mixed expressions, curiosity, annoyance, surprise, and worst of all, indifference. She felt every glance like icy needles piercing her skin. The stares of well-dressed adults in suits of people who believed they had the right to remain detached from a blatant injustice happening right before them. Not a single person spoke up. Not a single person stood and asked, "What's going on?" or even suggested, "Could we double-check the ticket?" That silence heavier than any accusation. Jasmine took a deep breath, her small hand clutched the strap of her backpack, But she didn't cry, she didn't beg, she didn't panic. All that remained inside was a dull, throbbing ache. Once again, all her efforts weren't enough to erase the prejudice others had already cast upon her. Karen Mitchell raised her chin, her eyes glittering with a cheap sense of triumph. She didn't bother to call a colleague to verify the ticket, didn't check the passenger list, didn't summon the cabin supervisor for assistance. She needed only one look, and her blind conviction that Jasmine Lee, the black girl in a worn hoodie and scuffed sneakers, could not possibly be a legitimate first-class passenger. With that distorted belief, Karen coldly ordered, "Take her bag, do. You're slowing down our boarding process." The voice that had been trained over years of serving first-class travelers now cut like a blade into Jasmine's chest, drawing no blood but slicing deep into her soul. Jasmine stood up. Her hand still clenched the backpack strap, trembling slightly, but no protest escaped her lips. Not because she thought she was wrong, not because she was afraid, but because she knew if she spoke up, she would immediately be labeled as disruptive, dragged off the plane under indifferent stares, turned into the problem instead of the victim. The humiliation didn't just come from Karen Mitchell's actions. It came from the silent, painful complicity of those around her. People who clearly saw but chose to look away. Jasmine bowed her head and quietly stepped out of her seat. The sound of her backpack strap brushing the floor echoed harshly in the dead silence of the first-class cabin. She walked slowly past the gleaming rows of seats, the designer suits and leather bags. Faces looked up, then quickly turned away as if avoiding her gaze absolved them of responsibility. Other eyes colder fell on her like invisible whips. "That's right. Go back where you belong. This place isn't for you." Jasmine bit her lip hard. Each step felt like she was carrying the weight of a long, bitter history of prejudice, rejection, and silent nods that pushed her into the shadows again and again. When she reached economy class, she found an empty seat by the window. She sank into it, her backpack placed neatly beneath her feet, her hands clasped tightly together as if trying to hold herself in place. Her gaze turned toward the window. But what she saw wasn't the vast blue sky, it was her own reflection in the glass, small, quiet, and once again pushed to the margins by narrow-minded prejudice. No one in the economy cabin asked if the girl needed help. No one spoke up to ask why she was sitting there, her eyes still carrying the scars of a wound not yet healed. Jasmine Lee sat in silence amid hurried whispers, stolen glances and faces that turned away to avoid her, like a shadow misplaced among strangers. In her small palm, she clutched her phone tightly. No tears, no anger. Only a quiet resolve that was steadily growing from within her trembling finger unlocked the phone. She opened the messaging app. Her small hand typed each word slowly, but with unwavering purpose. She forced me out of my seat. Said I wasn't allowed to sit there. "I'm in economy now." The message was sent in just a few short seconds, and in that still moment, Jasmine Lee didn't yet know. With that single tap, she had unknowingly triggered a silent earthquake, something no one on that flight, not even Karen Mitchell, could stop. When that small finger hit the send button, those few lines suddenly became as heavy as a lifetime's worth of repressed sighs. She kicked me out of my seat. "They don't believe I have a ticket." No resentment, no complaint. Just a bare, quiet truth packed into a few lines, the same way Jasmine had always chosen to face the world. The phone screen faded, reflecting the young girl's face with tightly pressed lips and distant eyes. Her shoulders, small but steady, were now carrying the weight of a violation no one should have to bear, especially not a 16-year-old girl. No one looked back as Jasmine walked down the aisle between the two cabins. No one asked what had happened. No one asked if she was okay. The invisible door between first class and economy, once just a number printed on a boarding pass, had suddenly become a chilling boundary. A mistake, in the eyes of someone in power, was enough to completely erase the rightful presence of a black student. Karen Mitchell did not look back. After handling the incident, as she often referred to such situations, Karen stood tall, adjusted the red scarf around her neck, then turned on her heel and headed for the galley at the front of the plane where flight attendants gathered before takeoff. Her face remained expressionless, as though she had just completed a routine task. No different from moving an oversized bag or reminding a passenger not to put their feet on the bulkhead. In Karen's eyes, Jasmine was not a human being with a right to be there. She was just an irregularity that needed correcting. In the galley, Karen poured herself a glass of water, took a sip, then leaned casually against the wall, calm as if nothing had just occurred. Outside, the passenger cabin began to fill. The sounds of bags being stowed, seats being adjusted, and quiet conversations gradually rose, covering up the void left by what had just happened. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat curled up in a seat near the back of the plane where the overhead light cast a dim, pale glow. She had chosen the window seat, as she always did whenever she felt out of place in a crowd. At least the sky outside was something no one could take away from her. Her old blue backpack, as familiar as her own skin, sat neatly at her feet. There was no room left inside her for anger or hatred. Only an empty silence remained. A cold ache radiated from her chest, the place where her belief in fairness had just been shoved off the runway, the same way she'd been pushed out of her seat. She bowed her head, her hands still trembling slightly. In her mind, Karen Mitchell's voice echoed like metal striking stone. "No way, you have to move back." That voice didn't just ring in her ears. It tolled like a warning bell in her heart. A heart that understood the world, still wasn't ready to accept her presence no matter how many accomplishments, how much effort, or how much pride she carried. But then the phone screen lit up. A tiny light like a candle in the wind. A message appeared from Dr. Camille Turner. Just two simple words. What happened? Short, but as heavy as the hundreds of science books Jasmine had once loved. Not just a question. It was an affirmation that someone was listening, believed her, and was ready to act on her behalf. Jasmine stared at those words for a long moment, then slowly typed back her hands, no longer trembling, now filled with determination. The head flight attendant didn't believe my ticket. She forced me out of my seat, said I couldn't sit in first class. I showed her my ticket. She didn't even look at it properly. I stayed silent, but they weren't silent with me. For the first time since walking the short path from the front of the plane to the back, Jasmine no longer felt alone. She knew Dr. Camille Turner. Her godmother was not an ordinary woman. She never stayed silent when justice was twisted, and she was not the kind of woman who would let a young black girl suffer this humiliation in silence. Outside, the sun had risen above the horizon, pouring golden light through the window, casting a brilliant but indifferent glow on Jasmine's face. She blinked, turned to look directly into the window pane as if she could see the horizon of justice slowly beginning to emerge. Beyond the cockpit door, the intercom system signaled an emergency. A voice came through from the ground operation firm commanding and serious. From that moment, Flight 263 was no longer just a routine commercial flight. It had become a turning point where the silence of one young girl was powerful enough to make an entire system of authority in the air stop, listen, and be held accountable. Jasmine Lee didn't know exactly what would happen next, but she was sure of one thing from the moment Dr. Camille Turner read her message. She was no longer alone on this journey. The phone screen lit up and immediately a reply appeared. No emojis, no empty reassurances like, "It'll be okay." Just 2 words, cold but firm. What happened? Jasmine stared at those words, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum, as if hope had suddenly rushed in during that one fleeting moment. Not hope in what Camille might do, but in the knowledge that on the other end of silence there was someone truly listening, believing her without needing further explanation. Her finger trembled slightly as she began typing a reply, but this time it wasn't from fear or shame. It was because something was beginning to change inside her. Something that felt like strength taking shape. The head flight attendant didn't believe I had a first-class ticket. She forced me out of my seat. I showed her the ticket, but she didn't check it. I'm now sitting in the back, flight 263, seat 3B. Jasmine hit send, as if casting all the pain she had just endured into an invisible current. The screen confirmed the message was sent. She waited in silence. Outside the window, morning sunlight gleamed golden on the runway, as if nothing had happened, as if the world continued on indifferent to the invisible wounds of a 16-year-old girl erased from a space that should have been hers. A few seconds later, a new message appeared. Stay where you are. Don't say anything else. Let me handle it. No exclamation marks, no hollow promises, no ill call the airline. The kind of line adults often say before forgetting. Just a short sentence. But it struck like a current through the fragile courage inside Jasmine, making her lift her head, sit upright, and loosen her grip on the backpack strap. She knew Dr. Camille Turner was not like anyone else. She wasn't just a loving godmother. She was also one of the most influential women in the American aviation industry. Director of Aviation Safety at the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA. The kind of woman who, with just one phone call, could make the largest airlines in the country issue public apologies, suspend routes, and re-audit their entire systems. And now that woman had started to act on the 48th floor of a glass tower in downtown Washington, D.C. Dr. Camille Turner was in the middle of a virtual meeting with the FAA Safety Advisory Board when the message came in. She showed no emotion. She quietly excused herself from the camera for a few minutes, stood up and walked to the tall glass window overlooking the street below. Her eyes were razor sharp, her lips pressed into a thin, unwavering line. After reading Jasmine's final message, Camille needed no further confirmation. She didn't ask for a cross-check. She didn't care about any excuse the flight attendant might offer. She knew exactly what had happened because she had seen it happen far too many times. And this time, it had happened to the one she loved most. Camille returned to her desk and dialed the emergency contact number for the flight operations team. Her voice was low deliberate, but as unyielding as a bronze bell ringing through steel. This is Director Camille Turner. I'm requesting the immediate delay of Atlantic Blue Flight 263, preparing for takeoff at Brighton International Airport, Reason. Mom. The voice on the other end sounded tense. High-priority federal complaint for discriminatory behavior and failure to follow ticket verification protocol against a minor in the first-class cabin. Full documentation will follow. For now, hold the plane at the gate pending independent review. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then came the response. Understood. Well, act immediately, Camille said nothing more. She ended the call, then composed a priority alert sent through the FAA communication system. Immediate FAA hold issued passenger Jasmine Lee, 16 years old, removed from confirmed seat, initiate emergency review procedure. In the cockpit of Flight 263, Captain Richard Moore had just received a standard operations check signal from the dispatch station when a flashing red indicator lit up on the internal screen, emergency hold position, per FAA request. He frowned, removed his headset, and turned to his co-pilot. Something's wrong. Stop, don't, taxi, to the runway. Technical issue, the co-pilot asked. Richard shook his head. No, this one came from way up top. Very high, and over 20 years of flying, he'd faced engine fires, disruptive passengers, and electrical malfunctions. But never had he been asked to abort takeoff because a passenger had been moved seats. He knew there was only one person at the FAA with the authority to act this swiftly. Camille Turner. He glanced at the passenger manifest now showing a highlighted note for review. Jasmine Lee. Seat 3B. Minor passenger ticket, fully verified. A new note appeared on the operations monitor. Removed without verification. FAA investigation active. In the front galley, Karen Mitchell had just taken a sip from her plastic cup when a fellow flight attendant rushed over, leaned in, and whispered, "Captain, just ordered the plane held at the gate." No takeoff allowed. Karen furrowed her brows, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Technical issue. No orders from above. FAA is stepping in. Karen's hand, still holding the cup, trembled slightly. The condensation on the rim suddenly felt ice cold. She said nothing more, but a flicker of worry sparked in her eyes. A kind of unease she had rarely experienced in nearly 2 decades of service. Karen Mitchell had no idea that a woman thousands of miles away had just issued a command, and that a hidden wave was now barreling toward her like a storm across a clear blue sky. In the cockpit, less than a minute after the FAA's hold order, Captain Richard Moore still had his hand on the control panel when a red light began flashing on the electronic display, followed by a firm voice through the priority communication system. Flight 263 hold position at gate. Do not taxi. Serious incident under investigation. The tone left no room for doubt. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a standard delay notice due to luggage or a late passenger. This was a direct order. From the highest level of authority, the Federal Aviation Administration, Captain Moore removed his headset, placing it gently on the control panel, his brow furrowing reflexively. He had faced all kinds of situations, false engine alerts, unruly passengers, even radar malfunctions while flying over Canadian airspace. But never in over 20 years of flying had he been told to halt an entire flight before takeoff because of a passenger complaint. He turned to his co-pilot, eyes sharp. Direct FAA order, hold at gate, no taxiing. The co-pilot nodded without question. Once the FAA intervened at this level, everything stopped. No arguments, no delays. Captain Moore activated the cabin intercom. His voice rang out steadily through the aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, we've received a request to hold at the gate for a short period while we complete a few technical procedures. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll update you as soon as we have more information. At the back of the economy cabin, Jasmine Lee heard every word. She didn't lift her head or look at anyone. But inside her chest, something stirred, a subtle current like a jolt of electricity. She wasn't sure if it was anxiety, hope, or the first winds of a gathering storm. No one, not even Karen Mitchell, could have imagined that a few short lines in a text message would bring an entire flight to a halt. In first class, Karen maintained her professional composure, but her eyes began to shift. If this were a technical issue, the maintenance crew would have arrived by now, but no one had appeared. No clanking tools, no footsteps of technicians, just silence. And that was the most dangerous sign of all. Karen set her cup down, adjusted her belt, and stepped out of the galley with her usual confident stride. But behind the uniform, her lips were dry, and in her chest a discomfort prickled like needles, a feeling she didn't want to face. What she had done moments ago, what she had believed to be by procedure, might no longer be justifiable. At the Northwind Air Operations Center, the FAA's priority alert flashed across the screen. The message appeared like a slap across the face. FAA Priority Alert. Violation of in-flight protocol. Passenger removed from assigned seat. Flight 263. Investigation initiated. The operations team immediately escalated the information to the airline executive director departments, were activated and sequence legal marked for emergency intervention. There was an unspoken rule every airline knew by heart. If the FAA intervened from the ground, this was no longer a customer complaint. This was an investigation, and everything had to be prepared as though facing a political crisis. In the passenger cabin, following the captain's announcement, silence was gradually replaced by slow exchanging glances and whispers. So faint they seemed like invisible stitches weaving through the air. A silver-haired man in a gray suit with a gold watch seated in 2C turned to the woman next to him. Mechanical issue. The woman tilted her head slightly, her voice low but sharp. Not technical. It's about a passenger. She glanced toward the economy cabin where Jasmine still sat quietly by the window. That girl. The man furrowed his brows. The black girl. But why he didn't finish his sentence. But the woman's gaze said it all. A heavy look, as if she had just realized she had witnessed something she should not have let pass in silence. At the very back of the plane, Jasmine Lee remained still. Her hands rested gently on her lap. Her phone lay on the tray table in front of her. The screen had gone dark, but the sunlight outside reflected her face. Gone was the innocent expression of a 16-year-old girl on her first flight. In its place was the gaze of someone waiting for something greater than herself. In Jasmine's heart, there was no fear left. In its place was a strange feeling, like standing in the eye of a storm. But this time, she knew she was not alone. In the front galley, Karen Mitchell walked down the aisle checking seat belts row by row, but the usual polite smile on her face had completely vanished. The nods, the friendly glances, no, tinged with visible unease, as though she were trying to patch together a mask already cracked, as she passed seat 3B, the one from which she had forced a young girl not even half an hour ago. Karen paused. The seat remained empty, its headrest neatly folded untouched. Everything was exactly as it had been when Jasmine was removed, tidy, proper, and denied. In Karen's mind, a voice echoed as if from the past. She showed her ticket, I didn't check it. Beneath the cold confidence, a flicker of doubt gnawed at her conviction in the decision she had just made. At the FAA Operations Center, Dr. Camille Turner received confirmation. Aircraft held at Gate Oversight Team, connecting with flight crew. Situation categorized Priority Level 1. Without a word, Camille gave a slight nod and opened the live flight map. On the screen, the symbol for Flight 263 glowed clearly, a single still dot amid a web of hundreds of fast-moving flights. One small glowing dot, yet it marked a girl removed from her seat, and a woman who chose not to stay silent. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but everyone on that flight, from those responsible to those who had looked away, was beginning to feel it. The sky was about to shift. First class remained bathed in soft golden light, the hum of the air conditioning steady, punctuated only by the occasional clink of glass or rustle of meal trays. After a few moments of hesitation, the refined passengers had returned to their phones and magazines, treating the delay like a minor technical issue. But Karen Mitchell, though outwardly composed, could feel the tension slowly splintering beneath the surface. She leaned against the galley wall, cup in hand. Eyes scanning first class as she always did, she looked no different from thousands of flights before. Still the sharp-poised Karen always in command, ruling the cabin as if it were her own domain, where she decided who belonged and who didn't. In Karen's mind, the situation had been handled by the book. Jasmine, a student in a hoodie and worn sneakers, didn't belong in first class. She had simply been returned to her rightful place. To Karen, that was a professional win, a necessary action to maintain the unspoken standards she had upheld for 15 years in the skies. But not everyone on the crew agreed. Eric Dawson, a young flight attendant with 3 years of experience, entered the cabin from the left aisle still holding a tray cloth. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "About that girl, I saw her ticket. It was for seat 3B. Karen turned to him, tilting her head slightly as if weighing whether to respond or pretend she hadn't heard. Then she gave a short laugh. Not amused, but polished with years of quiet arrogance. "Eric, you're still very green." Eric paused, his brows knitting slightly. Karen continued, lifting her glass like she was instructing a stubborn student. "In this job, a ticket alone doesn't tell the full story. You'll learn. Not everyone holding a first-class ticket truly belongs there. Some people, you just know something's off by looking at them." She didn't need to explain further. Her words exposed the flawed belief system she used to run her cabin. The standard wasn't in seat numbers. It was in appearance, attire, skin color, manner of speaking, and whether someone felt like they belonged in her view. Eric remained silent for a few moments. He wasn't one for confrontation, but his gaze toward Karen was no longer that of a rookie in doubt. It was the look of someone who had just witnessed a line being crossed beyond justification. He gave a small nod, then said quietly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear, "I think that girl didn't do anything wrong." Karen set her glass down on the tray, sighing as though forced to explain something painfully obvious. "You don't understand, Eric. On a plane, we have to maintain order. There's so much to manage. If people start sitting in the wrong seats and we don't sort it out from the start, what happens then?" She looked at him, eyes wide. "A girl like that, who knows where she's from? What if it was a mistake? Would you take responsibility if another passenger complained?" But even as the question left her lips, Karen felt a hollow space open up in her chest. A space she had never looked at directly or had deliberately ignored because she had never asked. Never checked the ticket properly. Never gave that girl a chance to prove she deserved the seat she had worked so hard to earn. Karen Mitchell had never verified a passenger. She never checked the manifest. Never called the cabin supervisor. She didn't follow any official procedure. She simply gave an order because something felt off. and now the entire flight was being held at the gate. Not due to technical failure or weather, but because of a decision rooted in bias, disguised beneath professional confidence. Eric Dawson said nothing more. He simply stepped back, gave a slight nod, and walked away. Leaving Karen alone in the galley where the distant hum of the engines couldn't drown out the oppressive silence closing in, Karen placed her hand on the cold metal counter of the galley, her gaze drifting into space as if searching for some justification for what she had just done. But, for the first time in 15 years in the skies, Karen Mitchell felt that experience was no longer enough to shield her, not from the storm approaching a storm that wouldn't show up on radar. Because this time, she wasn't facing just a young girl. She was facing a system that was waking up. Karen remained there, hand resting loosely on the galley edge, her eyes distant, as if hoping the clink of a spoon against a glass might restore some sense of order. But that fragile moment shattered when the cockpit door swung open. A dull light from the control panel sliced a sharp beam across the aisle, and Captain Richard Moorcalm, composed the kind of man who left the cockpit only in emergencies, teetered his head and called out clearly, "Miss Mitchell, step in here for a moment." No explanation, no collegial tone, just a terse command enough to set off every internal alarm in Karen's body. She swallowed dryly, stood up straight, smoothed her skirt, and walked toward the cockpit with the composed gait she had practiced in front of a mirror, the stance of someone who always had things under control. But the closer she got, the more her heartbeat stuttered, and an old buried unease began to crawl up her spine. The door closed behind her, the air inside was cool yet heavy. Captain Moore didn't sit. He stood beside the co-pilot's chair, one hand resting on the seat back, eyes coldly fixed on the headset hanging nearby. Without a word, he nodded toward it, a cue. "Put it on." Karen stared at him for a moment, as if waiting for an explanation. But when all she received was that firm nod, she complied. She put on the headset, her lips still holding a thin, practiced smile as if this were just a routine check-in. But the moment the voice came through the headset, that smile froze like wax meeting ice. "This is James Sandler, Senior Administrator at the FAA, speaking on behalf of Director Camille Turner." Just hearing that name made Karen's chest tighten. Dr. Camille Turner. A name that commanded respect across the aviation world. Not because of power, but because of reputation and principles that were immovable. If her name appeared in an investigation, it would never end with just an apology. It would end in consequences. The voice continued, not giving Karen time to breathe. "We've received an emergency complaint from Director Turner regarding a minor passenger being removed from her first-class seat, despite holding a valid ticket and committing no violation." The voice wasn't loud or angry, but each word struck like a hammer against glass, so sharp and cold that Karen's palms began to sweat. The passenger's name is Jasmine Lee, 16 years old, ticketed for seat 3B. She was asked to vacate that seat without any ticket verification or coordination with flight crew. Karen opened her mouth instinctively, ready to explain, an old reflex, just like she had used in response to countless passenger complaints before I just thought that. But James Sandler cut in sharply. "I'm not asking what you thought, I'm asking. Did you verify the ticket against the manifest or with ground staff?" "No way out." Karen paused, then responded softly, her voice trembling slightly. "No, I only glanced at the ticket, so you did not verify. You made a decision about a passenger's legitimacy based purely on intuition." Silence. A silence that stretched long like a frozen second hand on a clock. Then James's voice dropped steady and cold like the wind before a storm. "Are you aware that this passenger is the goddaughter of the FAA director? And even if she weren't to remove a valid passenger simply because you felt they didn't belong, violates at least 3 federal safety protocols and internal FAA procedures." At that moment, Karen could no longer register the details. Phrases like violation of protocol, failure to verify, and emergency complaint spun through her head like a hurricane. 15 years of experience. Once, her solid shield could no longer protect her from the brutal truth. She had made a decision not based on procedure, but on prejudice. "Listen carefully," James's voice hardened. "You will return to economy class, invite Jasmine Lee back to her seat in first class, and you will do so with courtesy in public with a clear and verbal apology." Karen opened her mouth, meaning to ask, "Can I speak to the girl privately?" But the response came before she could finish. "No, your action happened in front of passengers. Your apology will too. Your apology must be just as public as the action you committed." After that sentence, Karen Mitchell gave a slight nod. Her lips parted, but no word strong enough came forth to stop the storm, waiting outside the cockpit door. "A federal inspector will be waiting for you on the ground. A formal investigation will begin, and we expect your full cooperation." The static faded from her headset, but the emptiness that remained in Karen's ears felt like a silent scream reverberating through the sealed space of the cockpit. Her hands trembling, she removed the headset. This once familiar place, where she had confidently entered hundreds of times, now felt small, suffocating. When Karen Mitchell stepped out of the cockpit, she was no longer the woman in control. She had become a figure in the silent courtroom of public judgment, where every glance was a judge awaiting explanation. The door closed behind her. Her heels pressed softly into the thick carpet of first class, but with each step toward economy, the armor of confidence she had worn so tightly began to fall away piece by piece. Her red silk scarf was still tied according to airline standard, her uniform still immaculate, her hair perfectly in place. But none of those outer perfections could hide the growing unease in Karen's eyes or the way her hands clenched instinctively at her sides. The stares began. No longer admiration from passengers toward a seasoned flight attendant, but quiet suspicion, curiosity, and a dawning awareness. A few looked up from their magazines. Others leaned down to whisper. No one greeted her. No familiar nods. The atmosphere in the cabin felt as though the air pressure had shifted. A silence even Karen could no longer deny had meaning. When she reached economy, Karen Mitchell saw Jasmine Lee sitting quietly by the window in the front row, back straight, hands resting on her worn backpack. Gaze fixed outside, each step closer to Jasmine felt like sinking deeper into cold water, where every excuse Karen had once used to shield herself now rang hollow. For the first time in nearly 2 decades of her career, Karen Mitchell didn't know how to begin. A few seconds passed in silence. Then she pressed her lips together, trying to draw from whatever was left of her professional reserve. A strained smile, like a hairline crack in glass catching the light, flickered across her face. "There was a bit of a misunderstanding. Miss Lee, would you please return to seat 3? This time, Karen's voice lacked its usual sharpness or authority. Each word dragged from her throat, awkward and discordant. Jasmine didn't turn right away. She slowly tilted her head, her eyes meeting Carnsnow. Longer angry, no longer surprised. In those eyes was a calm, cutting light sharp as a blade. the look of someone who fully understood the truth. Why was I the only one asked to show my ticket? Why didn't you ask the white man sitting next to me? The question wasn't an accusation. It was a direct incision into the core of the issue. Karen froze, her throat dry, no justification left. Nearby passengers began to glance over. No one spoke, but the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The weight of those silent stares closed in around Karen like a wall inching closer. I didn't mean to. It was just reflex. Her voice weakened with every word, as if she herself realized how hollow it sounded, because she knew the truth. This wasn't a careless mistake. It was prejudice. Jasmine said nothing. She simply stood, lifting her backpack from under her seat. No words, no glance back, but as she passed Karen, she paused for a single second. No turning, no eye contact. Just one sentence, soft as wind, but powerful enough to strip away the last layer of Karen's armor. If I hadn't sent that message, no one would have known. I'd just be another kid in the wrong seat. No one would care. No one would ask Karen. Mitchell felt the last of her defenses fall away. That sentence wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry, but it was a verdict, cold and clear. No courtroom required. No judge, no jury. Just the truth spoken aloud, and that alone was enough to shake an entire system awake. Jasmine Lee walked steadily toward the first-class cabin, her small figure in the old hoodie, but her steps no longer heavy, like when she'd been forced to leave her seat. Each of her steps now was a knock on the invisible door of the system, a door that had slammed shut before her simply because of her skin color and her silence. No one clapped. No one welcomed her. No looks of encouragement. But the silence had changed. Before the silence was indifference. Now the silence was awareness. Jasmine felt every eye on her, watching her. Every move, the eyes that had once turned away, that had whispered, "This isn't my problem now," couldn't meet her gaze as she walked past the first row of seats. A woman wearing pearl earrings quickly ducked her head and rummaged through her purse as if remembering something important. The gray-haired man in the seat near 3B glanced briefly and turned to the window. His brows furrowed as though burdened by an unspoken question. Jasmine stopped in front of seat 3B, the seat from which she had been pulled away like an intruder. It was still there, leaning at the angle she had adjusted it to. No one had sat in it. No one had touched it. She bent down and placed her moss-green worn backpack at her feet, then sat down, her back straight, her hands resting gently on her thighs. No one told her to be strong, but no one could make her shrink back again either. Whispers began behind her. Someone cleared their throat. Another adjusted their glasses. A young woman leaned over to whisper to her husband. Then a middle-aged man from the opposite row spoke quietly, just loud enough for everyone around to hear we've been silent in the wrong way. The words weren't directed at anyone specific, but everyone in the cabin felt as though they were aimed at them. Those who had witnessed the humiliation of the young girl. Those who had heard the cold order to remove her from her seat. Those who could have spoken up but chose to do nothing. Jasmine didn't turn back. She didn't respond, but those words still hung in the air. No one needed to repeat them. Up front. Karen Mitchell stood leaning against the cold metal counter in the galley, her eyes blankly fixed on the light streaming through the small window. She heard the words, and though no one mentioned her by name, Karen knew exactly who that man was speaking about. Not because he knew everything, but because her actions had exposed the truth right before the collective gaze. Throughout her airline career, Karen had never felt the cabin become so alien and suffocating as it did now. Everything was still the same. The narrow aisles, the high-end leather seats, the clean, polished glassware. But now the cabin felt like a courtroom where every detail was evidence against her. Karen's gaze settled on seat 3B. Jasmine was sitting there, still as a statue. Not turning back, not looking at her once, no anger, no hatred. And that was what Karen couldn't bear. If the girl had erupted, screamed, cried, Karen could have branded her hysterical. But no, Jasmine simply existed. Sat there in silence, and that was enough to make everyone look at themselves. In the first-class cabin, the atmosphere continued to shift. A few passengers began pulling out their phones, not for entertainment. To look up the news, an internal memo had leaked, flight delayed due to violation of protocol with minor passenger. Someone whispered, "Isn't that girl the daughter of an FAA official?" Another quietly replied, "I heard she's the director of aviation safety." Though nothing had been officially confirmed, the news began to spread beyond the cabin, reaching the ground operations office, then slipping into the ears of the media, social networks, and even powerful agencies. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat still. No smile, no tears, no change. The phone screen remained off, but she knew Dr. Camille Turner was watching every move. And Jasmine also knew what was happening now wasn't just for her. It was for all those who had ever been cast aside simply because they didn't fit in there. For the first time on this journey, Jasmine rested her head against the seat. Not to rest, but to allow herself to feel the space that had once been taken from her. This time as someone who truly deserved to sit there. Inside the cabin, the silent wave was gradually turning into an aftershock, not just between the rows of seats, but within the flight crew itself. The exchanged glances between the two cabins were no longer just curiosity. Now they carried a very real sense of what awaited them on the ground. Jasmine Lee raised her head and quietly watched as two figures entered the first-class cabin. Just as she had anticipated, they said nothing, but their presence was a powerful statement. There were no greetings, no smiles, only the heavy silence that in itself carried a tremendous force. Karen Mitchell stood still, unwilling to move. Jasmine sat calmly in seat 3B. Her eyes no longer filled with surprise. She didn't need to say anything. She just needed to sit there in the stillness, and everyone knew what was happening. Officer Rhodes and her companion, a tall man in a gray suit, entered the first-class space with an undeniable seriousness. The passengers around immediately stopped whatever they were doing. The rustle of magazines, the tap of phone, everything halted as if everyone was waiting for a signal. Karen Mitchell didn't move. She just stood there, gripping the cold edge of the galley counter. Her eyes vacant as she stared ahead, as if trying to avoid confronting the truth. She knew what was coming, and she knew that her silence could no longer protect her. Officer Rhodes didn't immediately look toward Karen. She simply gestured for her colleague to head toward the cockpit where Captain Richard Moore was waiting. A few short words were exchanged. Then Officer Rhodes turned and began scanning the first-class cabin. The disapproving gazes of the passengers started to focus on Karen. At this point, no one needed to ask anything further. Sandra Mitchell stood there like a pillar amidst the storm. She didn't dare look anyone in the eye, knowing they were all waiting for her to answer for her actions. Jasmine Lee didn't look back, but in her eyes a new light had appeared, not because of her personal victory, but because of the recognition from the very system that had once oppressed her. She just sat there saying nothing, because right now no one could erase the truth. No one could deny the truth of what had happened to her simply because of the color of her skin, a truth that had been proven undeniable. Captain Richard Moore turned back his gaze, sweeping over each passenger one last time before resting on Karen Mitchell. Although he was the one with authority in the cockpit, when FAA officials appeared, all power shifted to a larger system, a system that was unyielding, uncompromising, and especially unforgiving of any mistakes. Karen Mitchell looked directly at Officer Rhodes, then looked down at the cabin floor. She couldn't say anything more. At this moment, her criticisms, her justifications were worthless. All that remained was the image of the young girl sitting quietly in seat 3B, and the questioning gaze of a passenger that no one could hide from anymore. For the first time in her career, Karen couldn't defend herself. She slowly walked out of the cabin. Her steps were no longer confident, the eyes unavoidable. Everyone around seemed to be waiting for this story to end, but they knew it wouldn't end so easily. Meanwhile, Jasmine Lee remained seated in silence, her worn backpack placed neatly at her feet. The light streaming through the window illuminated her face full of calm. She knew she had not been wrong, and that was the reason others would have to face what they had done. When Karen Mitchell glanced back one last time, Jasmine Lee simply looked up, her clear gaze fixed ahead, as if her steps were a mark of freedom of justice that could no longer be concealed. Jasmine Lee didn't look back, but inside her a strange and resilient feeling began to rise. Sandra Mitchell, the woman who had stripped her of her seat, was now facing her own steps. Those steps were no longer free, no longer full of power. Every step she took was a step closer to a truth she could not deny. The airplane door opened, and in front of Sandra Mitchell was a black SUV, its flashing lights silently present, but enough to confirm that this was no ordinary incident. Although no heavy intervention had occurred, everyone understood that things had gone too far, and now she had to answer. Jasmine Lee sat quietly, saying nothing. She didn't need to do anything. Her silence alone was enough to make everyone around her confront what they had witnessed. She didn't need to speak, didn't need to shout. Just her presence was a stronger statement than any words. Karen Mitchell walked slowly, her feet heavy, as if she were not walking freely, but being led by an invisible force. As she passed seat 3B, where Jasmine had once sat, their eyes met in a quiet moment. There was no hatred, no anger, just an understanding. In Jasmine's eyes, Karen Mitchell couldn't bear that gaze, the gaze where Jasmine needed no words, but made Sandra feel like an outsider, no longer in control, no longer able to defend any reason. The black SUV quietly drove away, leaving only a faint red glow on the airport tarmac under the dim morning light. Jasmine watched it, not with a look of revenge, but with a steady gaze, as if she knew that justice doesn't come from revenge or grand victories, but from the perseverance of those who don't give up, those who don't turn away. In the first-class cabin, no one spoke. No one stood up to clap. No one offered words of comfort. Everyone sat in silence, as if this plane had become an irretrievable spectacle, a place where they could no longer continue to live in the indifference they had before. An elderly man sitting in seat 1A turned to his wife and whispered softly, as if afraid of losing something precious they had just witnessed. She stopped the entire flight with just her patience. The woman didn't reply, but she gently held her husband's hand as if she were holding something fragile yet real. Yes, it was responsibility. As a citizen, concept many in first class had never truly understood, Until now, Jasmine Lee didn't feel the need to do anything. She wasn't in a hurry, wasn't chasing any goal. She just sat there with a calmness no one could take away. Sandra Mitchell stepped off the plane, no longer walking like someone in control of everything. Every step she took was like a new wave crashing against her, making her feel there was no protection left. No one stood up to help her. No one spoke words of comfort. She walked alone, like someone walking through the journey of paying the price. And then, finally, the passengers began to stand. Slow steps, one by one. They started to leave the cabin, but no one dared approach Jasmine Lee, because her quiet presence now outweighed any encouragement. In the cabin, the silence continued, but this silence was not one of shame. It was one of acknowledgement. People looked at each other saying nothing, but in their hearts they understood that what they had just witnessed was not the end, but the beginning of a new journey. A door that had opened for people like Jasmine. Jasmine Lee didn't rush to stand. She didn't rush for anything. She just sat there, and in the first-class cabin, one by one, eyes turned toward her like a promise. We see you now, and this time we won't forget. Jasmine Lee did not hurry. She no longer needed to prove anything. After everything, she walked off the plane with a steady, unwavering gaze. Each step she took wasn't just an action. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing firm. It was a journey of recognition, one that could no longer be denied. She didn't need to do anything grand. Just sitting upright in first class was a silent sign that she had won. Flight 263 took off from the airport with no applause, no praise for Jasmine. All that remained was a heavy silence where the witnesses had to face the truth of the injustice they had once been indifferent to, and now they could not turn away. All they could do was look and realize their mistake. Naomi Turner. Jasmine's godmother was waiting at the end of the plane's stairs. She wore a blue coat, her hair neatly styled, and her eyes looked at Jasmine with warmth and determination, as if no words were needed to express her unconditional support for the young girl. Jasmine didn't need to ask. There was no need for a greeting or any words to express what they both knew. Naomi just looked at her, offering a soft smile, not in a rush. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Jasmine nodded gently, responding, "I don't need them to shout that I was right. I just needed them to stop and think." Naomi gently patted Jasmine on the shoulder. No more words were needed. The two of them turned away and walked into the airport terminal. No medals, no speeches. Just silent steps and the truth. As Jasmine and Naomi disappeared into the corridor, the sunlight outside couldn't dispel the storm brewing within American aviation. And this wasn't just the story of one girl, but the story of all those like her. At the headquarters of Northwind Airlines, an emergency meeting was called less than 3 hours after Flight 263 was delayed. No more whispers, no more email, replies, or private Zoom meetings. Everyone in the executive boardroom, from the CEO, legal director, human resources, to the head of flight safety, was faced with what they had been avoiding for years: the system's responsibility. The FAA report was presented first neatly in a cold white file: High Severity Passenger Service Violation Report. Under this heading was the shocking preliminary conclusion. The passenger was discriminated against based on appearance. CEO Martin Raines, known for his tough stance and refusal to accept failure, sat up straight. Hands clasped, eyes still fixed on the event summary displayed on the LCD screen between the table. Under the white light from the ceiling, the wrinkles on his forehead weren't from age, but because for the first time in his career, He realized this issue couldn't be handled with just a press release. "How much time do we have?" his voice hoarse from answering calls all morning. The legal director quickly responded, "No more time. The media has already started reporting. FAA requires an update every 48 hours. If we don't act now, we'll lose the public's trust and possibly our operating license." A heavy silence filled the room enough to hear someone grip their pen tightly. The head of Human Resources. A sharp woman with an authoritative voice spoke slowly. "This time, the FAA requires 3 mandatory actions starting next week. First, all crew members, regardless of rank, must undergo monthly anti-bias training instead of the annual training as before. Second, the check-in system and flight attendants must implement a 2-step seat verification process. Third, we must establish a policy to protect whistleblowers from discrimination, whether passengers or internal staff." She paused for a moment before continuing in a grave tone. "And finally, the FAA has officially confirmed that Chief Flight Attendant Karen Mitchell will be fired immediately. No reconsideration." A few heads bowed. One person quietly tore a piece of paper, crumpling it in their hand. Karen Mitchell, once seen as the center of discipline for senior crew members, had now become the living example of what happens when confidence surpasses humanity. A communications consultant in the room spoke up. "How will we handle the public?" There's a viral video online of the passenger looking back when the FAA boarded. It shows her face. The online community is calling her the girl who stopped the flight. Martin Rains sat silently for a few seconds, then slowly nodded. "We can't fight this wave." Just a few hours later, a series of official statements were issued, not just in the usual cold and detached language, but with a noticeably altered tone. "We recognize that Flight 263 has highlighted a serious gap in our procedures and human awareness. Passenger Jasmine Lee was treated unjustly, and this will never happen again." From Northwind Airlines branches, internal communications sent out 3 new directives. Anti-bias training will be conducted monthly with clear verification measures. Absences will not be allowed. All flight attendants must adhere to a 2-step seat verification process, both electronically and manually with ground staff. Any employee who witnesses discrimination or ignores discrimination by others will face immediate disciplinary action without exception. In a small meeting room at the FAA, Dr. Camille Turner, not in a power suit, but sitting quietly with her laptop in front of her, reviewed the new policy draft, a revision named the Passenger Protection Policy for Minor Passengers from Discrimination Clause, Jasmine Lee. A small note at the bottom of the page read, "We do not rewrite procedures just for the sake of appearances. We rewrite them so that no 16-year-old girl ever has to cry in silence again." When the announcement, titled Clause Jasmine Lee, was passed and sent to all airlines across the U.S., the name of that 16-year-old girl was officially embedded into the system. No longer just an internet phenomenon, but a part of the legal, cultural, and humanitarian framework of the aviation industry. Jasmine knew this, but she didn't smile. She didn't see herself as a pioneer. She just wanted to go back to being a normal student. Someone who didn't need to prove that she deserved respect. When major media outlets tried to reach Dr. Camille Turner for interviews and famous magazines invited Jasmine to be on the cover to tell her story with headlines like "The Girl Who Changed the Sky," Jasmine declined them all. Not out of fear. Not to run away, but because what she did was never for show. She just wanted to be seen as equal. However, even though she chose silence, the story of Flight 263 continued to be told everywhere, and in a way no one could ignore. At airline crew training centers across the U.S., a video from the internal cabin cameras of Flight 263 was added to the mandatory training program. It was not just a lesson on how to handle issues with passengers, but a vivid reminder of the harm of unconscious bias. Something that could start with an innocent question, but bury the dignity of a person. At high schools, especially in civics and sociology classes, teachers printed out summaries of the incident with discussion questions. If you were the person sitting next to Jasmine that day, what would you have done? The story was no longer just an event. It had become a lesson. Not in textbooks, but a lesson that left a deeper mark than any chapter. One day, at a small student advisory group meeting at a high school in Seattle, a ninth-grade student with curly hair stood up after watching the video reenactment of the flight. That girl didn't need to yell. She just needed to stand firm in her belief. And that's why adults need to listen. The supervising teacher didn't say anything, but that day the school added a new unit on professional bias in the orientation program for office and security staff. At an aviation industry conference in Atlanta, Dr. Camille Turner this time, not as the director in a report, but as the keynote speaker, took the stage in a simple dark suit, without any fancy slides, only holding an old faded photograph. Jasmine, sitting in seat 3B, sat upright, her hand gently placed on her backpack. She said, "This is how a revolution begins. Not with loud noises, not with violence, but by a girl refusing to leave the seat she deserves to have." The entire auditorium fell silent, and for the first time in many years, no one laughed. No one clapped in the usual polite manner. Everyone sat still, letting the silence rise from within their hearts. At a seminar at a university, when Jasmine finally agreed to participate, not on television, but in a private class for students studying passenger management, she was asked, "How did you stay calm when everyone turned their back on you?" The girl paused for a few seconds, then answered slowly, "Because I knew I didn't do anything wrong, and I knew there would be people standing beside me." The answer didn't evoke strong emotions. It didn't make anyone cry or clap, but it made all eyes drop as everyone wondered to themselves, would I be the one to stand up or would I keep silent? Karen Mitchell disappeared from the professional radar. Her industry record was marked with a red flag, and no airline would dare sign a new contract with her. She wasn't arrested. She wasn't publicly shamed in the media. But within the flight attendant community, her name became a warning bell. Each new training lesson now begins with one question: don't become another Karen Mitchell. On a quiet evening, Jasmine sat by the window holding a cup of hot cocoa. Her eyes gazing at the twinkling stars outside. Dr. Camille Turner sat working on her laptop at a nearby table, the light from the screen casting a calm glow on her face. They didn't say anything, just listening to the gentle wind outside the window and the rhythmic tapping of the keyboard. After a while, Dr. Camille Turner looked up and gently asked, "If you could do it all over again, would you do anything differently?" Jasmine smiled, turned her head back, and answered in a voice as soft as a breath, but as firm as stone. "I'd still sit in seat 3B, and this time no one will make me stand up." We have just experienced an emotional and powerful story together about a small but resilient girl who dared to stand up for justice and respect. Jasmine Lee is not just a name, but a symbol of perseverance and determination in fighting against injustice. What she did was not for seeking attention, but because she knew she deserved to be respected and recognized just like anyone else. Her story is not just a personal action, but has become the voice of many people who have been treated unfairly simply because they didn't fit the standards of some system. This story has not only changed the aviation industry, but it also serves as a great lesson about recognizing and treating everyone fairly, regardless of their skin color, background, or appearance. It reminds us that every action we take can create change. Sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up, speak the truth, and stand firm in their beliefs, and everything will change. From Jasmine's silence on Flight 263 to the resolute steps she took afterward, we see clearly that justice does not always come with grand gestures, but sometimes it is simply a quiet but powerful act. It is from this silence that great changes have begun. This story is proof that if we are persistent and never give up on believing in ourselves and justice, no matter how difficult life may be in the end, we will be recognized for what we truly deserve. Remember, each of us can make a difference, whether big or small, as long as we dare to stand up and speak out. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss the upcoming stories that will continue to inspire and motivate you. We will always walk together, spreading positive values and working towards building a more just world. Remember, small but resilient actions can create great changes. Keep believing in yourself and never stop dreaming of a brighter future.